We are accustomed to thinking of power as something distant and centralized: the president, the police, the court. But Michel Foucault turns this perspective upside down. He insists, power is not the pinnacle of a pyramid. Power circulates everywhere. It is inscribed in language, in norms, in the most ordinary gestures of everyday life. When you open TikTok and adjust yourself to its algorithm, when you fill out a medical questionnaire, when you laugh at a meme, you are already inside the network of power. And here is the crucial point. Power does not merely constrain, it produces our identities, our desires, our very notions of what counts as normal. Why does this matter for you today? Because if you want to understand how algorithms, institutions, and discourses are shaping you, you must learn to see the world through Foucault's eyes. This is not an academic luxury. It is a practical philosophy for the 21st century. In this video, we will examine how power operates through language and knowledge, how it transforms surveillance into self-discipline, how even resistance itself is reabsorbed into new norms, and above all, how by grasping the mechanics of power, you can reclaim a space for freedom and critical choice. Michel Foucault was born in 1926 into a Europe that had not yet recovered from the First World War and was soon to be divided again by the Second. He grew up in a society where institutions, schools, psychiatric hospitals, the army, prisons, claimed to educate, protect, and care for individuals. Yet behind this humanist facade, there operated another logic: classification, control, discipline. This was a century in which Europe was undergoing the crisis of all the grand systems of thought. Marxism explained power in terms of property and class domination. Foucault, though inspired by Marxist questions, rejected the simple scheme: those who own are those who rule. His thought went deeper. Power is not a possession, but a network of relations. Existentialism, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, located freedom in the subject who makes choices. Foucault, by contrast, showed that the subject itself is the product of historical practices. We do not precede power, we are shaped by it. Structuralism explained culture through deep underlying structures. But Foucault went further. For him, structures were not immobile forms, but historically shifting discourses that produce reality. Foucault was not a purely armchair thinker. His method was archaeology and genealogy. He immersed himself in the archives of hospitals, court records, regulations for schools, and prisons. In Madness and Civilization, he demonstrated that madness is not an objective medical fact, but a category created by society. In Discipline and Punish, he traced how punishment evolved, from the spectacle of public executions to the subtle system of surveillance and discipline. In The History of Sexuality, he argued that power does not merely prohibit, but also produces. It creates the very categories of identity through which we come to understand ourselves. Thus, Foucault is situated within the broader intellectual context of the 20th century. He debates with Marxism, radically criticizes humanism and existentialism, while at the same time absorbing and surpassing structuralism. And in the process, he forges his own distinctive vocabulary: the language of discourse, power, knowledge, and practices. In 1970, Foucault delivered his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, the Order of Discourse. It was an event. A young but already scandalously renowned professor steps onto the podium and, from the very first minutes, challenges the entire academic tradition. He declares that speech is never neutral. In every society, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized, and redistributed according to a certain number of procedures. The Order of Discourse, 1970. For the audience, this sounded like provocation. Until Foucault, words had largely been seen as mere reflections of reality. He insisted, instead, discourse is an instrument of power. Here it is crucial to clarify. By discourse, Foucault meant not simply language, but an entire network of practices, institutions, and norms that determine which statements are possible and which are not. Discourse shapes the field of thought. It decides what counts as truth, who has the right to speak it, and what consequences follow. To make this concrete, consider a contemporary example. When the state introduces the category of essential workers, it is not merely describing reality, it is creating a distinction. Some people become vital, while others become secondary. This is not fact, but an act of power. Foucault develops this further in the history of sexuality. Power produces knowledge, and power and knowledge directly imply one another. The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 1976. Scientific discourses, psychiatry, medicine, criminology, not only uncover new truths, but also generate the categories through which we think ourselves: heterosexual, homosexual, normal, deviant. This is why Foucault does not reduce power to repression. Power not only prohibits, it produces reality itself, our identities, our habits, our modes of speech, even our forms of desire. Modern examples make this evident. School report cards do not simply record a child's knowledge. They generate social identity: the gifted, the problem student, the lazy one. The meme, "Okay Boomer," does not just mirror a generational conflict. It produces the category of the boomer with all its connotations and boundaries. Thus, for Foucault, discourse is not the wrapping of reality. It is the very fabric of power, where language, norms, institutions, and knowledge converge. And this makes clear power surrounds us not only in laws and decrees, but in the most ordinary words we speak and hear every day. And here, I cannot help but recall YouTube. To put it in Foucauldian terms, algorithms too are discourse. They decide what becomes visible and what disappears, which means if you want this video not to vanish into the digital Panopticon, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. It is a small act of resistance against oblivion. Foucault begins Discipline and Punish, 1975, with a vivid and shocking scene: the public execution of Damiens in 18th century France. A crowd gathers in the square. The executioners quarter the body of the condemned. Organs are thrown aside. Cries fill the air. This is the theater of power, authority displaying itself through blood, pain, and spectacle. Yet within only a few decades, punishment changes radically. Public executions vanish. They are replaced by prisons, schools, barracks, hospitals. Power no longer needs the display of terror. It becomes invisible, and for that very reason, even more effective. Here, Foucault introduces the famous image of the Panopticon, originally proposed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. The Panopticon is a circular prison with a central tower. The prisoner never knows whether he is being watched at a given moment. As a result, he begins to behave as if he were always under surveillance. Foucault writes, "He who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection, Discipline and Punish, 1975. The key here is not the prison's architecture, but the model of power. The Panopticon is a metaphor for a disciplinary society in which individuals internalize norms and monitor themselves. Power becomes interiorized. It produces docile bodies and disciplined souls. It is not enough simply to say, algorithms are the new surveillance. For Foucault, the Panopticon is a model of power in which surveillance is transformed into self-surveillance, and the body is rendered docile through normalization. His famous formula in Discipline and Punish is concise. Visibility is a trap. The trap is not that we are being watched. The trap is that we begin to watch ourselves through the eyes of power and measure ourselves against its norms. Later, in his lectures at the Collège de France, 1978-79, he shows the next step from discipline to biopolitics. Power now works not only on individual bodies, but also on populations, statistics, risks. This is what he calls governmentality, the conduct of conduct. Power shapes the field of the possible, making certain trajectories more probable than others. Let us now translate this optic into the digital age. Examination and the norm. In disciplinary institutions, the key technique is the exam, combining surveillance and normalization. Today, the exam takes the form of algorithmic metrics: reach, retention, CTR, credit scores, activity rings. They do not simply describe, but establish the norm. We unconsciously measure ourselves against them, adjusting our behavior, shaping the environment. In the logic of security, power does not punish every deviation. It creates an environment where the desired behavior becomes statistically more likely. The algorithmic feed is precisely such an environment: personalization, A/B tests, ranking. Here, power operates through probabilities rather than prohibitions, confession and the production of the subject. In the history of sexuality, Foucault analyzes the Western ritual of confession. Power compels us to speak the truth about ourselves. Today, we confess to algorithms, sleep and mood trackers, self-diagnosis forms, corporate dashboards. We voluntarily supply data in exchange for the promise of truth about ourselves. Thus, there emerges the subject, who becomes the entrepreneur of the self. Normalization of resistance. Even gestures of resistance, digital detox, mindfulness, are quickly transformed into new disciplines and markets. This is the Foucauldian paradox. Power reworks even rebellion, converting it into a form of manageable behavior. Distributed power. The Panopticon is not Big Brother, but a network of micropowers. In the digital sphere, this is especially evident. Moderators, format rules, ranking algorithms, user agreements. Together they form the regime of truth of the platform, where truth is what is measurable and clickable. And here the central question arises: how can one act within this order? Foucault has no illusions. To step outside power is impossible. But local practices of resistance are possible, to shift criteria of value beyond algorithmic norms, to deliberately disrupt the rituals of the exam, with publications that elude quantification, to build communities with their own ethics of interpretation. In this way, the digital panopticon ceases to be a mere metaphor and becomes what it was for Foucault: an analysis of the technologies of power that shape us, our gestures, our desires, our truths. The paradox is that disciplinary power appears gentler than the tortures of the 18th century. Yet it is deeper. It operates not through fear, but through the internal consent to normalization. And this is precisely why returning to Foucault today is not an exercise for historians of ideas, but a practical philosophy for the 21st century. By the way, since you have disciplined yourself and made it this far, perform one more small exercise. Subscribe to the channel. Let this be your personal panopticon against the algorithm. For Foucault, one of the most radical insights was this: knowledge never exists outside of power. We are used to thinking truth is objective, standing above politics, and interests. But Foucault overturns this view. In Discipline and Punish, he writes, "We should admit that power produces knowledge, that power and knowledge directly imply one another, that there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations." Discipline and Punish, 1975. What does this mean? That knowledge is not a pure reflection of the world, but a mode of ordering in which power is always already at work. 1. Archaeology: How Knowledge Creates Truths. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Foucault shows what we call science, or objective truth, always depends on the rules of discourse. Psychiatry, medicine, criminology, pedagogy. They do not simply describe reality. They generate the categories through which we think ourselves. Normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, criminal and rehabilitated. These are not natural facts, but the results of discursive practices. 2. The exam is the fusion of power and knowledge. Foucault demonstrates disciplinary institutions invented a special instrument, the examination. The exam simultaneously gathers knowledge. Who are you? And distributes power. Who do you become? Report cards, medical files, personal dossiers. These are archives where knowledge is transformed into a technology of power. The examination combines the techniques of an observing hierarchy and those of a normalizing judgment. It establishes over individuals a visibility through which one differentiates them and judges them. Discipline and Punish, 1975. Regimes of truth. Later, Foucault introduces the notion of regimes of truth. In every epoch, there are forms of knowledge accepted as truth, and institutions that guarantee them. In the 19th century, medicine and psychiatry. Today, neuroscience, psychology, data science, economics. What matters for Foucault is not the disciplines themselves, but the regimes of truth, the networks of practices, institutions, and discourses that authorize certain knowledges as truth. The 21st century, big data and algorithmic truth. Today, knowledge and power converge in the infrastructures of big data. Algorithms collect trillions of traces, likes, clicks, routes, transactions, and convert them into new norms. Who is reliable? Who is risky? Who is productive? These are not facts, but outputs of models that then begin to regulate our lives. Credit scores are not just predictions. They are categories that determine who gains access to resources. Corporate KPIs are not neutral metrics. They are instruments of normalization, transforming each worker into a project of self-management. Mental health and wellness apps promise care, but in fact impose new norms. How much to sleep, how to meditate, how to regulate emotions. 5. Confession and self-control. In the history of sexuality, Foucault shows, modern power compels us to confess, to tell the truth about ourselves to doctors, priests, psychologists. Today, this confession has become digital. Daily reports from fitness trackers, mood journals, productivity dashboards. We supply the data ourselves because we believe it contains the truth about us. But it is precisely this truth that becomes a technology of self-control. Thus, for Foucault, knowledge does not illuminate reality. It structures its very field. And in the 21st century, power and knowledge fuse in algorithms, databases, and expert discourses. We imagine we are appealing to neutral facts, but in reality, we are entering into new regimes of truth that shape our behavior. And here lies the practical force of the Foucauldian optic. Not to ask only, is this true or false? But what relations of power does this knowledge make possible? Whose life does it normalize? And whose does it exclude? If we accept that power and knowledge always form a single network, It becomes clear every slogan, every metric, every hashtag is not just text. It is a discursive practice that shapes the boundaries of the possible. Foucault wrote, "Truth is of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effects of power." Truth and Juridical Forms, 1973. This becomes especially evident when we examine the language of modernity, political slogans, corporate credos, hashtags. Enhanced version, contemporary examples. Foucault insisted, truth isn't outside power. Truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint, and it induces regular effects of power. Truth and Juridical Forms, 1973. This becomes especially clear when we look at the language of our own era. Political slogans, corporate credos, hashtags. 1. Political slogan, law and order. These words appear transparent. Who could be against law and order? But their power lies precisely in their selectivity. For some, they signal protection. For others, exclusion. For the migrant or the protester, this is not a universal truth, but a threat. Foucault shows that the discourse of power always produces distinctions. Law and order does not merely describe reality. It draws dividing lines. Who belongs to the community of normal citizens, and who is cast into suspicion. Corporate credo, move fast and break things. In Silicon Valley, this slogan became the emblem of freedom, startup culture, boldness. But in practice, it disciplines. The norm becomes permanent speed, stress, and burnout. Foucault warned, power reaches into the very grain of individuals, touches their bodies, and inserts itself into their actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes, and everyday lives. Discipline and Punish, 1975. Here we see exactly this. The slogan turns work into a field of discipline, where the willingness to break, even oneself, is valorized. Freedom masks the normalization of exhaustion. Social movements. Let us take two examples that began as acts of resistance, but quickly turned into new regimes of truth. Body positivity. Initially, the hashtag emerged as a protest against imposed beauty standards. It was a grassroots movement, blogs, unretouched photos. The call to love oneself. For many, this was a first language of liberation. Finally, one could say, my body does not have to conform to someone else's norms. But soon, corporations appropriated the discourse. Brands realized resistance could be turned into a market. In 2014, Aerie launched the hashtag #AerieReal campaign, no retouching, diverse body types, and recorded rising sales. Dove built an AD campaign around hashtag #SpeakBeautiful. Nike installed plus-size mannequins in its London store. All of this looked like support, but in fact, the hashtag had become a new norm, now controlled not by activists, but by corporations. Foucault would explain it this way: discourse, even when it begins as challenge, over time turns into a technology of power. To be body positive becomes a demand, a new form of self-regulation. Smile, love yourself, buy the right products. Resistance is absorbed and normalized. Hashtag #MeToo. A similar trajectory can be seen in hashtag #MeToo. At first, it was a cry of pain. The hashtag gave millions of women a voice to speak about violence usually silenced. It was a digital confession, precisely what Foucault analyzed in the history of sexuality. Power compels us to speak the truth about ourselves. But when the flood of testimonies became overwhelming, institutions stepped in. Uber and Google changed internal policies, dropping mandatory arbitration in harassment cases. Gillette launched a campaign against toxic masculinity using the language of the movement. Media, brands, HR departments, all incorporated #MeToo into their practices. Here we see the Foucauldian paradox. What began as resistance became a new regime of truth. The hashtag became a brand, a marketing tool, a compliance factor. Women gained a language to speak, but corporations gained new instruments to regulate, measure, report. Both examples show the same principle. Power never confines itself to prohibitions. It produces identities, norms, and markets. Even where rebellion emerges, power knows how to rework it into its own logic. Foucault taught us to see this not as tragedy, but as analysis. Power always produces more than it destroys, which is why the real question is not, have we defeated power? But what is being born within resistance? And who gains control over this new truth? Each of these cases reveals the Foucauldian paradox. Power does not only limit, it creates reality, generating categories, identities, markets. And even when we resist, resistance often becomes the new norm. Thus, the question Foucault leaves us with is not, are we free, but rather, what forms of truth and norms are being produced right now, and whom do they render visible, and whom invisible? We have seen how slogans and hashtags produce reality. Now, I am curious, what examples have you noticed? Write in the comments your favorite slogan or meme. That works more powerfully than law. I promise, together we'll try to deconstruct it, or at least have a good laugh at it. Foucault never offered recipes for liberation. He did not say, here is the enemy, here is the plan, here is victory. His gesture was different, to show that power is the fabric of our everyday lives. And if one cannot step outside it, one can at least learn to see it differently. That is why his philosophy is less a theory than a practice of attention. Small exercises that render the invisible visible. Try these exercises in philosophical perception yourself. 1. When you scroll through Instagram, do not ask only, do I like this content? Ask, what habits does the very structure of the feed instill? The algorithm does not simply show you pictures. It organizes your time, shapes your desires, imposes regimes of comparison. It is not a background, but a disciplinary practice, turning you into a subject who measures himself through likes and engagement. 2. When you listen to a political speech, ask what categories is it creating? Whom does it include? Whom does it exclude? The slogan, law and order, sounds universal, but who exactly does it render lawful? And who is left outside? This is how one reads discourse, not only by words, but by the lines of division they enact. 3. When the subject is medicine and vaccination, Foucault, of course, never discussed vaccination directly, but his models of biopolitics allow us to analyze such practices. Here, the stakes are literally vital. Health, vulnerability, sometimes life itself. The issue is not simply for or against, but how is the discourse structured in which we make our decisions? For Foucault, biopolitics marks the shift of power from punishing individual bodies to managing populations through risks, probabilities, environments. He contrasts the plague city, discipline, confinement, control of each body, with the smallpox city, security, statistics, thresholds, inoculation. The mechanism is key. Power works not only through prohibitions, but through norms and risk calculations that define proper behavior. 4. When you hear corporate talk about productivity, KPI, efficiency, work-life balance, it all sounds like care. But ask, what kind of subject is being produced here? This is not just an evaluation of labor. It is a disciplinary discourse that turns you into an entrepreneur of the self, into a project of continuous self-management. These exercises are not paranoia, but a form of philosophical training. They allow you to see that power does not merely forbid, it produces our desires, our habits, our identities. And in this attentiveness lies the first step toward freedom. not as escape, but as conscious movement within the network of power. For Foucault, resistance is never limited to inner reflection. It also emerges in collective practices, in new forms of solidarity, in social movements, in the creation of alternative institutions. In other words, small gestures of attentiveness can connect into larger networks of resistance. Foucault unsettles us because he shows that power is not something external, not a tower, not a throne. It is a network in which we all participate. It runs through language, norms, institutions, algorithms. It shapes what we call normal, and even what we call ourselves. Yet it is precisely here that the possibility of freedom appears. Not in the illusion of stepping outside. There is no such outside, but in the ability to see the mechanisms that are usually hidden. In the ability to ask not only, what does this mean? But first of all, what does this do? When you scroll your feed, when you listen to a political speech, when you read a slogan, or sign a medical form, you are already inside the network of power. But if you see how it works, you cease to be only its object. You become a participant, capable of choice. Foucault wrote, "Where there is power, there is resistance." The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 1976, and in this lies hope. If power is everywhere, then so too is the possibility of rethinking it. Thus, Foucault's lesson is not despair. It is a new form of freedom, not escape, but attentiveness, critique, and the capacity to act in the smallest gestures of everyday life. Foucault reminds us, where there is power, there is also resistance. And on YouTube, resistance can be very simple. Share this video with your friends. The algorithm counts it as a signal of quality. But for us, it is a way to expand a community of people who want to think more deeply. So, if you found this video useful, pass it along to those ready to see the world through a Foucauldian lens.